Hi, this is Braschek recording this on August 17th, Tuesday. Not sure when this one will run. This is just sort of a perspective uh, session. It occurs to me how our world these days, and maybe always, but certainly in the last 20 years, has been run on manufactured fear. And you're either going to hear this before the 20th anniversary of 9/11 or after. I'm not sure when you're going to get it, but that is an example of manufactured fear. Uh, I'm not saying there wasn't a catastrophic event on 9/11, but the way it was framed and then exploited for the next, well, it's still going on today, for the next 20 years, um, is part of, I guess we could call it the fear industry. We're also now living through a period of mass insanity. Not everybody has drunk the Kool-Aid. Tens of millions have not, um, but tens of millions have. And amongst those tens of millions, there are millions that are little foot soldiers for the insanity, helping push it on a volunteer basis. Then, of course, there are the tens of thousands of people employed whose employment basically depends on ignoring common sense, ignoring reality, and promoting a fear agenda. Um, I had a talk with a very reputable, very experienced nurse, decades of experience, very serious person, and we were talking about COVID, and I brought up the subject. She's talking about all the people that are dying. I was like, yep, people die all the time, right? Well, yeah, they do. She knows that. She works in a hospital. And then I asked her, well, what about the other diseases these people have when they come in? And she admitted, yeah, you are not dying of COVID unless you are morbidly obese, unless you are already diabetic. She's just not, unless you have some other major problems. Um, but that's not something that she can talk about publicly or that she can, share with friends and family unless they ask her point blank. But, we're always told that the frontline heroes are the heroes and they know it all. Well, if you actually ask them what's going on, you will hear the reality that these are already sick people who are, when challenged with a health challenge, sometimes have a bad reaction and sometimes die, as happens every day of the week and as always happened before COVID and will happen after COVID. But anyway, COVID's another example of the scare industry, the fear industry working in overdrive. And we've done videos on this in the past, but or probably makes sense to talk about it again. Pre 9/11, and it's hard to remember what pre 9/11 was. In fact, there may be people listening to this that don't remember because they're too young. But pre 9/11, there was already a large, fat, and busy um, terrorism fear industry in the United States. You had um, experts, you had consultants, you had think tank members, you had academicians, and it was literally an industry pre 9/11 of cooking up reasons for us to A, expect a massive terrorist act, and B, be and live in terror of a terrorist act. And these people, they got a fair amount of traction. They were in the news on a fairly regular basis. They certainly had their little conferences and conventions. They published their articles and their books, and they got their academic appointments, and they got their paychecks because, believe me, nobody's doing this stuff for free. Uh, and they just kept the drums beating until we had a absolutely traumatic, catastrophic event. Uh, the actual cause of which still not fully understood. I think everybody with half a brain knows, and especially if you ever saw the Twin Towers, you're not bringing those down with a little fire and a plane crash. You're certainly not bringing them down in a perfect footprint. So that's the beginning, middle, and end of that story. Um, and I think it's clear to everybody with even a scintilla of intelligence that the official story is complete nonsense. But in any event, there it's important to remember there was an industry before 9/11 that was pushing fear of terrorism, and that as soon as that triggering event, that crystallizing event occurred, those people suddenly became the leaders, and they were controlling the narrative. And we have all kinds of laws now in place that make life miserable for people. Going to the airport, already a misery, became even more miserable. Civil rights lost. Surveillance, I mean, it's unbelievable. Surveillance of everything you do is now the norm. We are now a country that tortures people, even though during World War II we did not do that, and persecuted and actually hung um, the other side for torturing people. But we've now made that a part of our national character. So all this flows from the fear of terrorism industry, um, and it's all somehow justified, and it's all somehow normal. And that's exactly what happened with COVID. There was a fear of pandemic industry that basically got started in the 1980s. And you can pinpoint that because we had something in World War I in which a lot of people died of medical causes, not they weren't killed in war, they died medically. And by the way, which is the norm for big, ugly, armed conflicts? At least as many people die of illness as die of violence, and sometimes many more. That's been since the beginning of time. Nothing new about that, especially for soldiers. They are malnourished. They are exposed to the elements. They are sleep deprived. They are traumatized. Um, they have poor sanitation often. They have poor medical care. You add all those things up together, and it's not too easy. It's not too hard to kill people with disease. It's just what happens. So we had some kind of a mass death event around World War One. Nobody did proper science then. You won't find any. You won't find autopsies. You won't find test results. You won't find adequate diagnosis. You won't find anything. But in the 1920s, years after the Great Flu, some experts got together and did a back of the envelope estimate and said, hey, about 20 million people died of the Great Flu. Okay. Again, no autopsies. Very few people were tested. Um, why people died? They could have died of all kinds of different causes. Tuberculosis, by the way, was rampant in those days. And you add stress and malnutrition to a mild case of tuberculosis, and that could also look like a respiratory disease, contagious respiratory disease, which of course tuberculosis is. Um, but in any event, the only estimate ever made on how many people died was 20 million worldwide in the middle of a horrific, horrific war. Then people went on with their business and nothing else was said or done or researched on the subject. And in the 1980s, 60, 70 years later, suddenly NIH funded researchers decided to take a fresh look at the pandemic of 1918. And with the distance of 60, 70 years, still no data. If an autopsy wasn't done in 1918, you still don't have it in 1984. With no autopsies, no tests, no real data of any kind, they decided, well, it wasn't 20 million, it was 50 million. And then later in the decade, somebody came along and said, it wasn't really 50, it was 100 million. Again, the nobody was able to go back in time and do proper science on this. but they kept ratcheting the numbers up. So that happened in the 1980s, and they have used that number of 100 million dead from the flu over and over and over again. And we don't even know if the 20 million is accurate. If the count back in the 20s was like our COVID count, it might have been more like 10 or 5. We don't know. We really don't know. But 100 million, that is clearly a generous uh, estimate, and that's being charitable. So they used that through the 80s, through the 90s, through the 2000s, through the 2010s to constantly, if you watch TED, by the way, if you know TED, those videos, capital T, capital E, capital D, if you watch those videos, there are dozens of videos on the following subjects. The big one is coming. It's not just Bill Gates. He had, there were dozens of people doing the same shtick. The big one's coming. We're not prepared. That was one of the themes of TED the last 10, 15 years. The other theme was, we've got a brand new way of making vaccines. It's groovy, cool, keen, it's just wonderful. And someday we're going to be able to use it. That's also been a theme of TED. So when people ask, well, how did everybody buy this story so quickly? It wasn't quick, folks. They've been spending 40 years selling it. Gates and Fauci and others have been building the infrastructure in the news media, in the public health arena, among NIH-funded scientists. They've been beating the drums for the big one is coming for at least 40 years, or close to 40 years. And they were conditioning the population to expect it. We did a video, and maybe I'll post it below. This is the biggest, one of the best pieces of evidence that the Kennedy assassination was planned in advance by people that also controlled the news media. The very morning that Kennedy was shot, a newscaster went into a long and spontaneous, apparently spontaneous, narration on the history of presidential assassinations. It was uncanny. And we'll post that. You have to see that. And all that is a matter of conditioning. They were making the impossible seem absolutely normal and predictable. And that's what they did with 9/11. They were simultaneously conditioning the population to expect some kind of terrorist attack. They were helping the government prepare in advance all kinds of harsh, insane measures, all of which targeted normal people, by the way. I mean, terrorists come and go with ease. They have no, real ones have no problem whatsoever, as we've shown many, many times. CIA and FBI and others really aren't interested in those guys. They're interested in making your life miserable, which they do really, really, really well. And so the same thing was happening pre-COVID. There was an industry of people beating the drum, building their network in the, amongst news media people, laying the paper groundwork, the paper foundation, coming up with all kinds of lunatic plans so that when the big one came, and it's debatable how big this really was if you actually count who actually became sick and what they were already sick with before they got sick with this thing, so that when the big one came, they would spring into action. So again, for people that keep asking me the question, well, how did everybody agree to the same thing internationally, globally? They had been conditioned for 40 years. They had been prepared for 40 years. The plans were in place for 40 years, and all they needed was a triggering, crystallizing event. So that's the story, a little bit of a background on this, and we'll put the video about Kennedy. We'll also put the video about the amount of money that Bill Gates has spent on corrupting the news media. For people that don't know, $100 million in the last 10 years alone given to press outlets like the Los Angeles Times and NPR and the Guardian in the UK to help them do health reporting, right? I'm going to put that video down there. I'm also going to put the video about the news broadcast right before the Kennedy assassination. It's a very eye-opening, sobering thing. But bottom line is these things don't come out of the blue. There's a whole industry and infrastructure that's hard at work for decades in advance so that when the crystallizing event happens, all this stuff is ready to go. Everybody knows the Patriot Act was written long before 9/11, right? They didn't 9/11 didn't happen and they just sat down and wrote the Patriot Act. They had the Patriot Act. It was so onerous, so horrific, so anti-American, so anti-democratic. There was no hope that something like that could ever be passed through. They just waited till the crystallizing event and rammed it down our throats, which is exactly what they've done with this COVID con. So this is Brass Check, free to you, not free to us. We have everybody can subscribe for free, but if you're an upstanding citizen, you might want to contribute and have a paid subscription. It helps us pay the server bill, the email bill, which we have to pay every month, and our tech helper. So to those that are supporting us financially, thank you. It makes it more pleasant. And for those that are not, you might want to consider it because you are not going to get this kind of analysis anywhere else.